Okay, so, we like to get into the nitty-gritty of some pretty complex stuff here.
Yeah,
And today is no exception.
definitely not.
You brought some really fascinating material to the table this time, and I think this is something a lot of our listeners think about.
Yeah.
It's the whole question of how we create a more sustainable planet, right? And we're gonna kind of go beyond the doom and gloom headlines.
And doom scrolling.
Yeah, and really trying to look at the data and how we can actually make a positive impact,
That's the goal.
Yeah.
To be a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah. And one of the sources that you highlighted that I thought was so interesting was Hannah Ritchie's book,
Yes.
Not the End of the World.
Not the end of the world. How we can be the first generation to build a sustainable planet.
Yeah. And she's coming from our world in data in Oxford.
Really, she's deeply steeped in evidence and data and...
Yeah. So this is going to be like a data-driven deep dive into...
Actually.
Yeah. How we can actually do this.
That's what we like.
Yeah, and it's so easy to get overwhelmed, isn't it? When you just look at,
Yeah.
the news every day or
social media.
Social media, yeah, it's like...
It's a fire hose of negativity.
It feels like everything's getting worse, like environmentally.
Yeah.
All the time. And she even talks about how, while she was at Oxford, like at this,
Leading institution.
Yeah, this leading university, she still felt this like...
Some sense of doom and...
Yeah, this ingrained pessimism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that feeling of helplessness is what can really be paralyzing.
Absolutely. It's that lack of agency, right?
Yeah.
You feel like there's nothing you could do, so why bother?
Right. And she points to the work of people like Hans Rosling who really advocated for stepping back and looking at the data.
Right. Looking at the long-term trends.
Yeah.
So Rosling, his focus was on global development and looking at the long-term data. And what he found was some pretty remarkable advancements in areas like poverty reduction.
Right.
Child survival rates, education access.
And it's so true because, we've talked about this on the show before, but the news cycle is designed to highlight like what's new and unusual.
Yeah, the things that grab your attention.
Yeah.
So bad news.
It's not really giving us a balanced view of like the slow progress that's happening.
Right, exactly. So things that are rare.
Right.
Unlikely events.
Yeah.
If they're novel and interesting, the news will focus on those.
Yeah.
And so they end up seeming much more likely than they actually are.
Yeah. And so when we're constantly bombarded with these apocalyptic narratives, it can really have this negative effect of just feeling like it's too late, like it's too big.
Right. That learned helplessness.
Yeah.
So, she talks about the example of the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target.
Yeah.
It's an important threshold, of course, but framing it as like an absolute end of the world scenario doesn't quite align with, the more nuanced understanding within the scientific community.
Yeah. Well, let's unpack that a little bit because I think that feeling of, it's too late to do anything, I think that can be really paralyzing for people.
Yeah, and so this is where she brings in this idea of urgent optimism.
Okay.
So recognizing the seriousness of the problems, because they're serious.
Yeah.
Climate change is already impacting billions of lives.
Right.
But it's about pairing that seriousness with the belief that positive change is achievable, that our actions can make a difference.
It's funny because it's almost like the opposite of what some of the more pessimistic voices tend to do, which is to kind of move the goalposts every time we make progress. It's like, oh, but now this is the new benchmark. And...
Yeah, exactly. And it's never enough.
Yeah.
And, she makes the point that environmental damage doesn't have to be an existential threat to be worthy of our attention.
Yeah.
It's already causing harm to billions of people in the present.
Yeah, it's like holding those two ideas in our minds at the same time.
Yeah.
It's serious, but we can actually do something about it.
Absolutely. It's about nuance.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the progress without downplaying the challenges that remain.
And she gives the example of child mortality rates.
Right.
Like the fact that it's more than halved globally.
Since 1990.
Since 1990. That's like a huge achievement.
It's incredible.
But it doesn't diminish the tragedy of the millions of children who still die each year.
Absolutely. And, one of the quotes she includes is from Max Roser.
Okay.
And he says, the world is much better.
Okay.
The world is still awful.
Okay.
The world can do much better.
Yeah.
And it's kind of holding all three of those things at the same time.
Okay.
That's the perspective we need.
Yeah, it's not just black and white.
No.
It's, there are good things happening.
Yeah.
We can do better. And we need to acknowledge the things that aren't good.
Absolutely. And, to put things in perspective, she provides some really important historical context.
Okay.
So think about the realities that our ancestors faced.
Yeah.
The constant struggle against famine, the incredibly high rates of infant mortality.
Yeah.
As recently as 1,843% of children didn't live to see their 5th birthday.
Wow.
Today, that figure is around 4%.
Yeah.
So it's still a tragedy for each individual life lost.
Of course.
But in the span of human history, that's a monumental improvement.
That is a huge improvement.
Yeah.
And she also talks about the progress in reducing global hunger.
Right.
Which is another area where, we've seen massive transformation.
Thanks to technological advancements in agriculture throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, and that's allowed us to, kind of break free from that precariousness of subsistence, living for a large portion of the world.
Absolutely. And speaking of, some of these common misconceptions, she addresses a couple of big ones that come up time and time again.
Yeah.
In these discussions about sustainability. Okay. One of them is this whole idea about uncontrolled population growth leading to environmental catastrophe.
The too many people.
The too many people argument. Yeah. But the data actually shows that the global population growth rate peaked in the 1960s.
Okay.
And it's been declining ever since.
Wow.
It's currently below 1% annually.
Okay.
And it's projected to continue falling.
Okay.
So
that whole idea of we've got to have population control. That's not really the issue.
Not only is it, ethically problematic to try to achieve these massive population reductions through inhumane means, but it's also completely unrealistic.
Yeah.
Our strategies for building a sustainable future need to work for the billions of people that are already here.
Right.
And the billions that are coming in the next few decades.
Right. And what about the concept of degrowth? I hear that a lot.
Yeah, she tackles that one head on. So she says that while a fair distribution of existing wealth is important, it's not enough to provide a high standard of living for everyone.
Okay.
She makes the case that economic growth, particularly growth that's driven by good technologies, technologies that solve environmental problems, that's actually a necessary part of eradicating poverty.
So it's not about shrinking the economy. It's about changing the kind of growth.
Exactly.
Okay.
So countries can achieve greater prosperity and become leaders in developing and deploying clean energy technologies, sustainable agriculture. There's a huge economic opportunity in leading the way towards a sustainable future.
Okay, so let's get into some of these specific environmental challenges.
Let's do it.
Air pollution is something that affects all of us.
Yeah.
And she frames this as a story of both progress and, remaining challenges.
Absolutely.
So it's easy to think of air pollution as a modern problem.
Right, a consequence of industrialization.
Yeah.
But the reality is that in many parts of the world, air quality is better now than it has been for centuries.
Really?
Yeah. Think about all the wood burning that happened, throughout history.
Right.
For heating and cooking.
Especially indoors.
Especially indoors, yeah.
It's almost counterintuitive.
It is a little bit, yeah.
Because we think of pre-industrial times as being cleaner.
Right. Yeah. Bucolic and pristine.
But inside it must have been awful.
Yeah. The air quality was probably terrible.
Yeah.
But we've also had some major successes in tackling air pollution.
Okay.
The Montreal Protocol is a great example.
Right.
That was an international agreement that phased out ozone-depleting substances.
Right.
So things like CFCs.
Right.
That were literally punching a hole in the ozone layer.
And that's a real success story.
It is. It's a huge win for global cooperation.
Yeah.
And she also talks about this concept of peak pollution.
Okay.
So many upper middle income countries, including China, have now reached and surpassed their peak levels of air pollution.
So it's starting to go down.
It's starting to go down.
Okay.
And what's really encouraging is that that period of rising and then falling air pollution is actually accelerating.
Okay.
So countries are achieving this turnaround much faster than the UK or the US did historically.
So that's good news.
That's good news.
But the human cost right now is still
tragically high.
Yeah.
Millions of people still die prematurely each year.
Yeah.
As a result of both outdoor and indoor air pollution.
Yeah. And she brings up the case of Ella Adu Kissi-Debrah, who was the first person to have air pollution officially listed as a cause of death.
Right. And while her case was unique in terms of that designation, it really highlights the deadly impact of these pollutants.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are some of the solutions that she outlines?
So several key strategies emerge.
Okay.
The first is universal access to clean cooking fuels.
Right.
It's astonishing that around 40% of the global population still relies on burning wood and charcoal for cooking.
Yeah.
Helping these communities transition to cleaner alternatives like gas or electricity would have a transformative impact.
Yeah, what else?
So another strategy is ending practices like crop burning after harvest, which is a major contributor to air pollution in some regions like India.
Right.
Then there's the implementing and upgrading of pollution-reducing technologies.
Okay.
So things like scrubbers that are installed in power plants that can capture harmful emissions.
Yeah, and transportation plays a huge role as well.
It does, absolutely.
Yeah.
So transitioning away from fossil fuel-powered vehicles is key.
Right.
Electric vehicles are better for the climate overall.
Right.
And the rate at which EV sales are growing globally is remarkable.
It is.
However, she points out that perhaps the most impactful solution, particularly for densely populated areas, is actually reducing car dependence.
Oh, interesting.
And promoting car-free living.
Yeah. So not just switching to cleaner vehicles, but reducing the number of vehicles.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And then finally, the shift to low-carbon energy sources, like nuclear and renewables.
Yeah.
This is a win-win.
Yeah.
Because it not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also significantly safer for human health.
Yeah.
She challenges some of the misconceptions around nuclear power, talking about how, the number of deaths associated with it is relatively low compared to other energy sources.
Yeah.
And then the decreasing cost of renewables, like solar wind and battery storage.
Right.
It's making this transition more and more viable.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about, some of these challenges and the things that we can do.
Right.
She also talks about things to stress less about.
Yes, she does.
And I love that because I think
it's a good reminder.
We need that.
Yeah.
Because it's just constant,
constant barrage of negativity.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one area that she highlights is the perception of increasing natural disasters. Now, it might feel like these events are becoming more common and more devastating.
Yeah, because that's what we see.
Right. That's what we see on the news. But the data shows a decline in death rates from disasters.
Really? Over what time period?
Over the last century.
Wow.
So it's not that the disasters themselves are less frequent or intense.
Okay.
It's that we've gotten better at responding to them.
Okay.
We have better infrastructure, better early warning systems.
Right.
And so we're able to mitigate the deadliest consequences.
That's a really important distinction.
It is.
Because it's true, like climate change might be increasing the frequency or intensity.
In some cases of some extreme weather events.
Right.
But we're also much better at dealing with them.
Yeah. We've learned how to,
adapt.
Yeah.
Be more resilient.
Yeah.
And, the increased reporting of these events can also create a skewed perception.
Right.
It can make it seem like things are getting worse, even though our resilience has actually grown.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Another myth that she debunks is the Amazon rainforest as the lungs of the earth.
Right, the lungs of the planet.
Yeah.
So
which we hear all the time.
All the time. Yeah, and the claim is that it produces 20% of the world's oxygen.
Right.
But while it's incredibly important for biodiversity and carbon storage, the Amazon's net contribution to global oxygen is actually close to zero.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the vast majority of the oxygen it produces is consumed by the forest itself.
Okay.
Through respiration.
So the real impact of deforestation
is on carbon emissions.
Right.
And the irreplaceable loss of biodiversity.
Not our ability to breathe.
Not directly, no.
Okay, so that's good to know.
Yeah.
Let's talk about deforestation, which is obviously a major concern.
It is.
And she paints a pretty complex picture of this.
She does.
So historically, there has been significant forest loss since the last glacial period.
Right, with agriculture being the main driver.
Okay.
And interestingly, the pattern of deforestation often follows a curve.
Okay.
Linked to a country's stage of development.
Oh, interesting.
So wealthier nations often experience a period of significant forest loss.
Okay.
Followed by regrowth.
Okay.
As their economies mature.
Oh, interesting.
And their agricultural practices become more efficient.
So the forest might actually return.
Yeah. In many developed countries, that's exactly what's happened.
Wow.
But currently, rates of deforestation are still high.
Okay.
Particularly in tropical regions.
Right.
Which are home to a lot of biodiversity.
Right.
Yeah. And the whole controversy around palm oil.
Yeah.
That's a good example of the complexity.
So palm oil gets a lot of negative attention.
It does.
But she points out that palm oil is actually really productive.
Very productive.
Compared to other vegetable oils.
Like soybean, coconut, olive oil.
So if we were to boycott it completely...
we'd likely need more land to produce the same amount of oil.
Right.
From these less efficient alternatives.
Which could lead to more deforestation.
Potentially, yeah.
Interesting.
So targeted efforts to reduce palm oil use in specific applications like biofuels are likely to be more effective than blanket bans.
Right. It's about looking at the nuance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not black and white.
And she also raises the point of historical deforestation in wealthy nations.
And she does.
Yeah.
So wealthy nations cleared vast amounts of forests during their own development.
Yeah.
And so she argues that there's an ethical case to be made for those countries to provide financial compensation to less wealthy nations.
Right.
To help them preserve their forests.
Yeah, because they're kind of being asked to forego the same development path.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a shared responsibility.
Okay, so let's talk about food systems.
Okay.
How do we feed a growing population sustainably?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
So she debunks this 60 harvests left claim.
Okay.
Which suggests that we're on the verge of a collapse in agriculture.
Right.
Due to soil degradation.
Right.
While healthy soil is vital,
this
specific prediction isn't supported by the data.
Okay, so that's a little bit of,
fear-mongering.
Yeah, and then she highlights the impact of the Haber-Bosch process.
Right, which allowed us to produce synthetic fertilizers.
Right.
On a massive scale.
Yeah.
And she says it's estimated that half of the world's population wouldn't be alive today.
Wow.
Without the increased yield.
From fertilizers.
Wow. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
However, she also points out that there are a lot of inefficiencies in our current system.
Okay.
So we actually produce enough calories to feed everyone.
Okay.
But we have issues like food waste,
right,
diversion of crops to animal feed, and biofuels, and then the inefficiency of meat production itself. A lot of the calories are lost.
Yeah. It's amazing how much goes into feeding
it is.
The animals that we eat.
It is, yeah.
And on a positive note, she says that global fertilizer use has plateaued.
It has.
And in many wealthier countries, efficiency is actually increasing.
That's right.
So what about the future of food?
Yeah, so she emphasizes improving crop yields.
Okay.
Particularly in regions like sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay.
She also talks about shifting to more plant-based diets.
Right.
Even partial reductions in meat and dairy can have a big impact.
Yeah.
And then developing and embracing meat substitutes.
Okay.
And plant-based dairy alternatives.
Right.
She even mentions hybrid burgers.
Hybrid burgers? What's that?
So these are burgers that blend conventional meat with plant-based protein.
Oh, interesting.
To kind of reduce overall meat consumption.
Okay. And what about organic farming? Because that's often presented as like...
the solution.
Yeah, the most sustainable.
Yeah.
But she gives a more nuanced take on that.
She does. While it can have benefits for biodiversity and soil health...
yeah.
It also has lower yields.
Okay.
So you need more land to produce the same amount of food.
Right.
And that can have its own environmental consequences.
Right.
And she also notes that the levels of pesticides in non-organic food are generally within safe limits.
Okay, so it's not just a simple...
black and white?
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
There are trade-offs to consider.
Okay, let's move on to biodiversity loss.
Okay.
Because that's another area where the headlines can be really scary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So she cautions against misinterpreting some of these headline statistics.
Okay.
Like the Living Planet Index.
Right.
Which reports an average decline in wildlife populations.
Right.
It's important to understand that this reflects an average trend.
Yeah.
Not a loss of 69% of all individual animals.
Right. So it's not like 69%.
Of all animals are gone.
Of all animals are gone.
Right. It's more nuanced than that. Yeah. She also talks about the complexity of valuing biodiversity.
Okay.
So, contrasting the functional importance of some species with the, intrinsic value and emotional connection we might have to others.
Right.
She uses the example of the northern white rhino.
Right.
Which is critically endangered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she highlights the shift that's occurred in global mammal biomass.
Yeah.
So domesticated livestock now outweigh all wild mammals combined.
That's right.
Wow.
Yeah, and insect decline is a serious issue.
Yeah.
It's been called death by 1,000 cuts.
Right.
Because of all the different pressures they face.
Right.
But it's not a universal insect apocalypse.
Okay.
The solutions need to be nuanced.
Yeah.
And we can't just ban all pesticides and fertilizers.
Right, because that would have other consequences.
Huge consequences for food production.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she says that, despite the current high rates of extinction, we're actually in a unique position.
We are.
Because we're the ones causing it.
We're the driving force.
Yeah.
Which means we can potentially slow it down or even reverse it.
That's empowering.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she points to examples of wildlife recovery.
Okay.
In different parts of the world.
Okay.
Like the rebound of some European wildlife population.
Okay.
Or the American bison.
Right.
So the key drivers of biodiversity loss are habitat destruction.
Okay.
Primarily for agriculture.
Right.
And then overexploitation of resources.
Okay.
So effective conservation strategies need to address these drivers.
Right.
And they need to involve local and indigenous communities who are often the stewards of the land.
Yeah.
And she mentions this idea of nature needs half.
Yeah.
Which is this proposal to protect half of the Earth's land area.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's ambitious.
It is very ambitious.
Okay, so let's talk about plastic pollution.
Okay.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere we see it.
Yeah.
We know it's a problem.
Yeah.
So she talks about the invention of plastic.
Right.
And the challenges with managing it responsibly at the end of its life.
Right.
She talks about the limitations of traditional recycling and the high cost of chemical recycling.
Yeah.
Interestingly, she points out that a lot of the plastic that enters the oceans comes from a relatively small number of rivers.
Really?
Yeah.
Where are those?
Predominantly in Asia and Africa.
Okay.
So this highlights the need for better waste management in those regions.
Yeah.
Because Europe and North America actually contribute relatively less to ocean plastic.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's really about
targeted interventions where they're most needed.
Okay. And what about the impact of microplastics on human health?
So the current evidence suggests that it's not a major concern.
Okay.
But more research is needed.
Yeah.
But in terms of solutions, investing in global waste management, supporting projects like the Ocean Cleanup, which is trying to remove existing plastic from the oceans, rethinking our reliance on single-use plastics.
Right.
Although she cautions that some alternatives to single-use plastics can actually have a higher carbon footprint if they're not reused.
Right.
And then well-managed landfills are also a necessary part of the solution.
Okay.
Despite the negative perceptions.
Okay, so it's not just about eliminating plastic. It's about managing it.
Managing it responsibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally, let's touch on overfishing.
Okay.
She debunks the empty oceans by 2048 claim.
Right.
Which was based on a misinterpretation of data.
Misinterpretation of data.
Yeah, and she highlights the work of Worm and Hilborn as a good example of data and collaboration leading to progress.
Progress, yeah. And while many fish stocks have faced depletion, there have also been some conservation success stories.
Right.
Like the comeback of certain whale species.
Right.
So sustainable fisheries management is making progress.
Okay.
But there's still challenges.
Yeah.
Especially with unregulated fishing.
Right.
And then there's the debate about what sustainable fishing actually means.
Right.
Does it mean maintaining populations at pre-fishing levels or maximizing sustainable yield?
Right.
And then the rise of aquaculture has now surpassed wild catch.
Okay.
So that's another potential pathway to meet demand.
Yeah.
But we need to manage the environmental impacts of aquaculture carefully.
Right.
And coral reefs are facing serious threats from warming waters, ocean acidification, other human pressures.
It's tough out there for a coral.
It is.
Yeah.
But things like seafood certification labels can help consumers make better choices.
Right.
And marine protected areas, when they're well managed, can be effective for conservation.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But I think the key takeaway is that the world does face serious environmental challenges.
Absolutely.
But significant progress has been made.
And solutions exist.
And solutions exist.
Yeah.
And that data-driven optimism is really important.
It is.
Yeah.
You know, we have to believe that we can make a difference.
Yeah, so hopefully you're feeling a little bit more empowered.
A little less overwhelmed.
Yeah, a little less overwhelmed and, to be able to critically evaluate the information that's out there.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought for you.
Okay.
What if we shifted our narrative away from doom